My name is Frank Pratt. I'm a retired fisheries biologist from the Wisconsin DNR.
What has already happened to the Midwest since the Industrial Revolution?
Great question. What has happened to the Midwest since the Industrial Revolution? Well, I'd say the first big change was not climate change, but was basically development of the landscape, which started when Wisconsin was settled, and in particular, really pushed into gear as Wisconsin, the northern forests were logged off and the state was developed for habitation and agriculture mostly. And that had a huge effect on the natural ecosystems. Basically, by deforesting most of northern Wisconsin, you complete and developing it for human development and agriculture in particular, you completely changed a lot of the watersheds. To an extent that warmed the water up, and it definitely changed the hydrology patterns in all of our major river systems. A lot more flooding, a lot more drought, and warmer water. And then coming along late in the obvious effects of climate change, as carbon dioxide in the air really went through the roof and the greenhouse effect really kicked in. And then we noticed a major warming of the air, and with it a major warming of the water. And that added another degree of change to the environment. The climate has completely changed. The natural ecosystems have completely changed. And this all happened in a century, a little over a century.
So, based on the warming that has already happened over the past 100 years, especially like with the temperatures warming by a couple degrees, how are these numbers significant to the natural ecosystems?
Okay, these numbers are, and that's a 2-degree change that's basically occurred since about 1980. So in the last 50 years or so, we've gained 2 degrees in average seasonal water temperature. This means that certain species that really thrive in cold water, species like brook trout, whitefish, cisco, lake trout, to an extent brown trout, northern pike, and some of the cool water fish like walleye are not faring as well as they used to, because they are encountering water temperatures, at least for part of the growing season, which is pretty much at their tolerance limits, if not lethal. So it's really restricted the range, the abundance, and the distribution of many of the cold water and cool water species already. And we're forecasting anywhere from a 2 to 9 degree change over the next century if climate change continues. So that is not good news for the cold water, cool water species.
So, let's say that climate change does continue. How would the Midwest environment ecosystems be impacted by, let's say, the end of the century?
It depends upon how much warming we're looking at. And it really depends on how serious we are as the human race in getting control of alternative energy and stop burning fossil fuels within the next 10 to 15 years. If we don't completely wean ourselves off fossil fuels in the next 10 to 15 years and basically somehow get on electrons that are not generated from burning carbon, it could be as dire as the survival of the human race is threatened. On the other hand, if we do get control of it, some of the changes that we've already put in effect in the atmosphere are going to have a staggered long-term effect, which even if we completely stop now, some of these effects are going to go on for the next 40 or so years. A lot of the models I've seen will basically make predictions based on best case, worst case, the worst case being the total extinction. The best case being we end our carbon dependency right now or real soon, and just have to ride out the lingering effects. And some mid-range thing, which is we get serious about carbon and we get off carbon in a reasonable amount of time, and in which case we're probably looking at another 2-degree change in water temperature. If we're on the outside end of that and we just don't do a very good job of it, we could be saying a 9-degree change in water temperature alone would be devastating to all of our ecosystems. There's no chance that any of the ecosystems that we're looking at right now could even survive intact with that type of change. So we're hoping for and assuming some sort of mid-range effect, and we're doing everything we can in addition to getting off carbon to, I would say, armor our watersheds so that we can not have as much negative synergistic effect between on the land environmental conditions and atmospheric carbon conditions. For example, one of the things that's going on right now due to climate change is our patterns of precipitation have completely, totally changed here in northern Wisconsin. We're getting about the same amount of precipitation on an annual basis, but a lot less is coming as snow melt right now. A lot more is coming as summer rain. And the most problematical part of that is these are summer rains that are coming in these gigantic superstorms, 7, 10, 11 inches of rain in a 24-hour period. And our watersheds are just not built to withstand that type of deluge. And then if you add on top of that a lot of agriculture, a lot of impervious surfaces, a lot of human development, you have tremendous amounts of soil erosion and runoff that go with that. And then you have nutrient problems that go along with that. And you've got one problem aggravating the other.
Even if we met scientific standards of going below the 1.5 degrees Celsius, what damage has already happened to the Midwest ecosystems, and what can we expect for future generations if we officially met the UN's?
The nature of our fisheries has changed a lot in terms of species composition. And it's probably not going to switch back to what it was. When I first came to Wisconsin, the premier in 1974, the premier game fish species here were, particularly in northern Wisconsin, was the walleye. That's what most anglers wanted. And a large number of our lakes and our streams, they were the dominant predator species. That's completely changed. Walleye are, I hesitate to say, on their way out, because there are going to be a relatively small number of waters, but a few waters where they're probably going to hang on. But their abundance has really crashed under climate change. And I don't think they're coming back. On the other hand, the sunfish, which would include the black bass, largemouth and smallmouth, and a lot of our favorite panfish species like bluegill, pumpkin seed, black crappie, they are thriving. They're absolutely thriving. A longer growing season benefits them. Warmer water temperatures benefit them. More eutrophic waters with more weeds, more phytoplankton, more productivity benefit them. So we're probably looking at the heyday of bass and panfish fishing in Wisconsin. So basically what we see to this date has been a shift away from the cold water, cool water species to those species that are considered to be purely warm water species.
How vital are these cold water fish to the Wisconsin ecosystem? Why should we care about these fish?
Why should we care about these fish? Why should we care about cold water fish? First of all, I personally care about cold water fish because I was born and raised a trout fisherman, and they continue to be my favorite species. And there are an awful lot of trout and salmon fishermen out there, and they generate a lot of recreational dollars. So it's a very economically valuable fishery. We should also care about the trouts and the salmons, and that being a cold water species, they are the canary in the coal mine. They're an indicator species. Even if you don't fish, even if you don't really give a rip about the environment, if you want your grandchildren or your children's children to be able to survive on this planet, you better be rooting for the trouts and the salmons. Okay, and that what is actually making specifically on the ground, the mechanism, making these cold water and cool water fish decrease. And I can tell you it varies by species, it varies by site. Some of the quote unquote answers that I was giving you are not theory level, they're not proven. They're only hypotheses, they're things that seem like could be happening, particularly with the walleye. To be honest with you, we know that it's a climate effect with walleye because it follows latitude, it follows temperature, it completely correlates with something that's a climatic effect. But the exact nature of it is hard to peg. It's not like with trout and salmon where it's a thermal tolerance thing. The water just gets too warm and those fish can no longer survive in that water. The water hasn't gotten too warm for walleye to survive. And there have been a number of hypotheses as what's going on with the walleye. One of them definitely, and it's not the primary cause, not at all the primary cause, but there are biotic relationships going on in our lakes. And two of the strongest competitive predator relationships, well documented in the natural community, are walleye and largemouth bass. So anything that's favoring largemouth and selecting against walleye is basically giving largemouth bass the upper hand in whatever competitive predaceous relationship the two species have. For about a 55-year period in Wisconsin, and a lot of people do not know this, but walleye were not originally a lake species in northern Wisconsin. They were originally a river species, a large river species, and they were successfully introduced by stocking into a number of natural lakes in northern Wisconsin, and over time became established and self-sustaining. And as they did, they depressed the previously existing native predator, the largemouth bass. And for about a 55-year period, they ruled the roost. You could go to a lake like, say, Nelson Lake, north of Haywood, and you could catch one walleye after another. And you might fish an entire season and never catch a largemouth bass. Now you can go to the same lake and you can catch numerous bass on any trip, and you may fish an entire season and no longer catch a walleye. That's how much it switched back to what it once was. So that's the walleye effect. But it's not, like a temperature that's lethal to walleye. My own personal hypothesis, and a number of people have expressed it, is what I would call the bounce hypothesis. One thing we've noticed that the DNR has noticed in their fall surveys, when you're looking for little baby fingerling walleyes with electrofishing in the shoreline and trying a thing we call your class strength. If you go in and you shock on a rocky shoreline in the fall or sandy shoreline in the fall, after the water's cool below 70 degrees, if there's any amount of natural reproduction, you'll get all these 4, 5, 6 inch fingerling baby natural walleyes. And if they haven't had good reproduction, you won't get many or you'll get none. Now, in the last 10 years, for example, we have had 8 incredibly warm years with winters that have been record mild. And right in the middle of them, as the models predict, due to the severe weather events prevailing under climate change, we had 2013, 2014, which were really, really long, hard winters, okay? And yet when we went in and looked at walleye year class strength, the fall boom shocking on lake shores to look for little baby walleyes, you would think counterintuitively that the warm years, the years with the warm winters, should stick out. Well, they do stick out. They stick out as total busts. And 2 years that stick out as good walleye reproduction years, 2013, 2014. How in the world could that happen? Well, I happen to be doing some survey work on Chippewa flowage in 2013, 2014. And I looked at the spring water temperatures now, also in 2012, which was to this date the record warm winter and the world record early ice out. I was fishing for crappie on the Chippewa flowage in 2012 on March 15th. The ice had completely left the lake. The waters had warmed up. The crappies were inshore and biting like crazy. It was unbelievable. In 2013, 2014, the ice wasn't even off the lake by opening day of the fishing season. In 2012, basically, we had an early ice out, but like it seems now, many of the early ice out years, the mild winter years, have springs where the water temperature and the air temperature bounces all over the map for about a 2-month period. The water temperature and the flowage changed by as much as 17 degrees Fahrenheit from day to day for about a 2-month period. As one cold front after another would come in, you'd have water temperatures that started to approach the spawning temperatures for bluegill and bass. And then we get a cold front, and overnight the water temperatures would drop down to the mid 40s again. So we're getting this incredible water temperature bounce. Well, that in itself isn't lethal to fish, and it certainly is not lethal to little baby developing walleyes. We know that they can continue to develop in the egg and the fry stage under those types of temperature conditions. What doesn't happen when you have those bouncy water temperatures, the zooplankton population does not develop well. So basically, you have walleye that hatch and probably hatch early. And when the little fry absorb their yolk sac and they swim up into the water column looking for something to eat, and usually they got to have the right prey in the right place in the right abundance at the right time. They need a certain species of Daphne or a certain size and right in their area at that time in a very, very high abundance. And in these mild winter, cold spring years, it doesn't happen. They probably just starve to death. So that's what I think the story might be with walleye. With trout, it's easier. Trout just plain can't take warm water. And if you have fairly marginal habitat to begin with, and then now you run into climate conditions where the water temperature is regularly exceeding 70 degrees during the summer months most of the time, trout have a really hard time holding on, just surviving. Never mind natural reproduction. And of course, with the other cold water species like lake trout, cisco, whitefish, etc., particularly if they're in a lake situation, it's a combination between temperature and oxygen, because these species occupy a relatively thin layer in a lake, in the midwater of a lake during the summer months. And it's got to be very, very cold and very well oxygenated. Well, two things are going on here. First of all, we're getting all these precipitation events on big summer precipitation events on the watershed in the middle of summer. And every time you have one of these giant washout events, whenever there's soil particles moving to a lake, they're carrying nutrients, particularly phosphorus, with them. So the lakes are becoming more nutrient rich. And under climate change, the growing season as well is now considerably longer. In many Septembers now, which used to be a fall or autumn month, the water temperature is still too high for these cold water species. So late in the season, what's often happening in a lake like Lake Coudray, for example, for whitefish and cisco, by the time we run into late August, the cold water zone has completely run out of oxygen because all the decay of all the organic matter falling from above has basically burned up the oxygen. And the fish no longer have the option of moving up into slightly warmer water to get more oxygen because it's too warm for them. So they're faced with a really double jeopardy situation. Do I want to sit here and not be able to breathe? Or do I want to move upward into the surface zone and boil? And so these species, particularly in lake environments, particularly in what we call our two-story lakes, are really facing declining summer habitat.
So could you go more into how vital the fisheries just to Wisconsin in general?
Fish are vital to Wisconsin. Why are fish so vital to Wisconsin? First of all, the economic effects from the recreation that fish generate is staggering. A large percentage of the population of Wisconsin fishes, and that fishing activity generates a huge economic impact. I think the latest figures I saw something like a $4 billion industry per year in Wisconsin. So it's one of our biggest industries. It's one of our biggest recreations. It's one of our biggest industries, and the fish support that. And that's just the recreational fishery. That doesn't even add the commercial fishery in there. And as I say, fish are tremendous indicators of a healthy watershed and a healthy ecosystem. A cold water lake or a two-story lake, that's typically it's a deep, clear lake, and people like to live on deep, clear lakes. Property values are high, etc. And as these lakes eutrophy, as they get more nutrients, one of the things that goes on is at a certain tipping point of the nutrients, the lakes will become green. They will become the major plant type will shift from rooted aquatic vegetation to floating or planktonic algae. And if a significant part of that algae is not green algae, but is really a bacterial species called blue-green algae, then you may run into problems, because blue-green algae produces a chemical substance, actually their blue-green pigmentation, it's called microcystin. And it's actually a blue-green algae species, it's called Microcystis. And when they reach high densities and a lot of microcystin is being produced, that's bad news for the health and welfare of a lot of living things. If I was on a lake, for example, where there was a blue-green algae bloom going on, I would not let my children swim there. I would certainly not let my dog drink the lake water, because there are wickedly strong neurotoxins which can put you into severe neurological problems and even respiratory arrest at very small concentrations. It seems like we have increasing instances of people who allow their dogs to go down and lap up the lake water when there's a blue-green algae bloom going, and the dog just plain collapses and dies. And has similar effects on humans. And in drinking water in Lake Erie, for example, in places like Akron, which draw their drinking water from the Maumee River, they monitor microcystin levels. And when they get above a certain level, they don't use the drinking water. They can't. There's too much of a danger to human health and safety. So if you're interested in human health and safety, you should be interested in keeping your lake clear and not letting it green up, in which case you should be interested in a buffer zone. You should be interested in regulating impervious surfaces. You should be interested in regulating agricultural runoff. You should be interested in regulating human development on the shoreline, because any type of runoff, which we've now acknowledged is increasingly likely to happen due to all these superstorm events, carries extra nutrients to the lake and causes the lake to eutrophy and makes it more likely you're going to have algae blooms. Why do I fight for climate change? My personal moral value set values the common good, not just in real time, not just of everybody else in my community, but in particular those that have no voice, and that would be future generations. I want to see a world where my great-granddaughter can at least touch or look at a brook trout and see how beautiful it is, rather than have to worry about whether she's even going to be able to survive from day to day on this planet. This is the fight of not just our lifetime, but this is the fight of human beings on the planet. We're fighting for the existence of living things on the planet here. That's how important this is.